I'm going to talk a little bit about what's actually happened in the public sector as our economy has changed and what that means for public sector bargaining. If you've been wondering what this slide is about, well, it's this presentation. So I'm going to start with some stuff that basically I'm sure everyone sort of knows, right? So like since the mid-1970s, real wages have basically been frozen, but the cost of living has continued to go up. So can someone tell me how people made ends meet? Debt, right? You borrow. State colleges in this country used to largely be free. At the same time that wages have stagnated, we've started raising tuition for students. How do students make ends meet? Debt, right? Like there's a pattern here. So similarly, we've also seen in the public sector, basically since 1980 or so, we've seen tax rates on corporations and high income earners really decline at the same time that we've had the greatest need for infrastructure investment and upgrades in the country because of just the amount of growth. And once again, the way that we've made ends meet is debt. Really, what's happened systematically in all parts of the economy over the last 35, 40 years is that debt has replaced income. Governments, we're no longer getting paid the money that we actually need. Instead, we're just borrowing it from the financier class, and we're paying it back to them with interest, right? And so as debt has skyrocketed in the country since the 1970s, and as that's happened, we've seen bank profits just soar, right? So this happens when you do a PowerPoint at 2 in the morning. You get the order of the slides wrong, right? So that's this slide. So we've seen, bank profits just completely soar, right? This is financial sector profits going back to World War II, but we start to see that in the mid-1970s, they start to rise precipitously. And what's actually happened now is that roughly a third of corporate profits in the US come from the financial sector, even though it only employs about 1% of the workforce, right? There's a huge outsized role that the financial sector plays in our economy. And so, in fact, there is now so much debt that banks have actually adjusted their business model. As we saw sort of debt start to explode, banks, in the past, they actually used to make the money primarily from interest income, right? Which was you make interest off the loans, the money that you lend out, and that's where your profits come from. Well, what we see over the last 30 years or so is a shift from interest income to fee-based income. So what that means is that instead of holding on to the loans and charging interest rates, instead what the banks do is they make the loans, they charge a fee for making the loan, they then securitize it, they package up, securitize it, sell it off in the secondary market, they charge fees for every step along the way, and then they service the loans and they charge fees for servicing the loans themselves. And in fact, it creates a situation where not only do they not care about the quality of the loans because they won't be the ones receiving the payments, but in some cases they actually have incentives to sell bad loans because they can charge more fees. Because if you're late on a payment, they can charge a late fee. If you go into foreclosure, they can charge foreclosure fees. There's all sorts of fees they can charge because at the end of the day, what they care about is quantity, not quality. And so as that's happened, this is what led to things like the predatory mortgage crisis, right? We basically saw banks that their main thing was they wanted to make sure that they had deal volume, so they came up with new products so that they can sell loans to as many people as possible. They didn't care about underwriting standards. They didn't care about whether the homeowner would actually be able to pay the loan back. In many cases, they sold people loans that were unaffordable to them, even though they qualified for affordable loans. And that was particularly done with communities of color. This shift, and we call this predatory lending, right? And so why am I talking about predatory lending? It's because the exact same thing has happened in the public sector with municipal finance. In much the same way that banks targeted cash-strapped, homeowners, low-wage workers with payday loans, they've also targeted cities and states with predatory municipal finance deals that have high costs, hidden risks. They're overly complex, and often they're designed to fail. And so, just to give you a little bit of background on how this happened. So since Reagan, really, there's been a dramatic shift in tax policy in this country. This is where I go back a couple of slides. So first, we've shifted. All that matters here is the lines, right? And basically, we've had this big shift, which is that we've replaced there's a shift from corporate taxes to individual taxes, right? So if you look at the share of taxes over time, back in 1934 it's roughly equal, but now a much larger share of taxes comes from the individual side, much less from the corporate side. Secondly, there's been a big shift to really reduce tax on the highest income taxpayers at the individual level. And we've seen both of these trends also mirrored at the state level with state taxes. And so what that means, in effect, what we've done is we've shifted the tax burden more and more to the people with the least ability to pay it, right? Because we're not charging corporations nearly as much, we're not taxing high income earners nearly as much. And so as I said, we did this at the exact same time that we had the greatest need for investment in the country. And so what we saw as a result is that total outstanding municipal debt has really grown tenfold since 1980. In 1980, total municipal bonds, which is state and local government borrowing, was under $400 billion. Now it's close to $4 trillion, right? This huge growth that was not there beforehand. And so, I mean, just to be clear, there's a whole fix the debt crowd that sort of says debt is bad because they want to push an austerity agenda. And that's not true. Like, long-term borrowing for long-term capital projects is a good thing. It makes a lot of sense. However, a lot of this borrowing was driven by budget shortfalls, where basically cities and states borrowing to make ends meet. Because they didn't have enough revenue coming in. And that is really problematic. That's basically, and in many cases what they're doing is they're borrowing to pay debt payments, right? They're actually like borrowing to pay off the credit card, that's actually really problematic. And so the thing is, when cities borrow, the investors in municipal bonds are largely high wealth individuals because municipal bonds because they're tax exempt, they have a lower rate of return, and really the primary market for them is high wealth individuals that use it as a tax shelter. And so what that means is that basically, instead of paying their fair share in taxes, the wealthy are able to lend us their tax dollars instead, and we have to pay it back to them with interest, right? Secondly, when we take out all these financial deals, we had to pay fees to banks at every step along the way. And so this means that with every single transaction, you have a set of banks that get their cut. They get to extract profit from every single piece of borrowing that goes on. And so this incentivizes them to sell public officials more complex and risky products. And in fact, I mean, there's this thing where they've developed more complex, exotic, risky products, just so they can then also sell you additional products to mitigate that risk, right? So it's like they say, well, take out a variable rate debt. It has all these risks, but you can mitigate those risks by taking out a swap, but that has some risk. Then you need a letter of credit on top of that, and you can buy all those things from us. It begs the question, why don't we just buy use a fixed rate bond? Because at the end of the day, when you actually add in all the fees for all of those things, it costs you just as much. The only difference is instead of that money going to bondholders, banks are getting a larger cut out of it. And the city is taking on much more risk as a result. And so as with predatory mortgages, all of this eventually came tumbling down for many cities and states that happened in 2008 with the financial crisis. As a result, taxpayers lost billions of dollars. Just to give an example of this, so one of these deals that was really problematic is something that we call, it's called interest rate swap. We call it a toxic swap because that's sexier than interest rate swap. That's really why. But the Detroit Water Department had many of these toxic swaps. And so basically these deals backfired in 2008 when the economy crashed and Detroit's credit rating got slashed several times. And in 2012, they had to terminate most of these deals and pay $537 million in penalties on the deals. Well, that's $500 million the Detroit water system did not have. And so what did they do? They actually ended up borrowing in order to pay off those payments. As a result, water bills doubled. Right, so now 40% of Detroiters' water bill goes towards paying back the penalties on the swaps that were backfired in 2012. And so when they're shutting off water in tens of thousands of people, the reason why people can't afford their water bills is because the money is going to pay off these swaps. If we look at the lead poisoning in Flint, Well, the stated justification for switching off of Detroit, Flint used to be on the Detroit water system. The justification for switching off of Detroit water was that it had become too expensive. Why had it suddenly become too expensive? Because of the swap payments, right? And so really, if we think about this, what does this mean for public sector unions? Sort of three things. So first, when a city or state has a lot of debt or bad financial deals, public officials' top priority is always to pay back that debt. So workers in public services are considered discretionary spending. Debt is always considered mandatory, right? You have to pay it back first. So for an example, so I live in Chicago. The state of Illinois is now 9 months into a budget stalemate where there has been no budget, no appropriations for spending. Basically, the state budget, the state spending is being done by court order. Only things that the court orders gets paid. And so it means that there's the state's not giving money to students for financial aid grants. They're not paying social service providers. They're talking about closing schools and even state universities. But at the same time that these payments aren't being paid, banks are actually being paid on the 1st and the 15th of every single month, even though it's actually illegal to pay them because there's no appropriation for that either. But they make a point to pay them. Workers and services get cut, but banks get paid first, banks and creditors. Right, so secondly, we're starting to see how the financial class is actually using debt as a union-busting tool. So many state constitutions specifically protect a public worker's pension benefits. So the big precedent from the Detroit bankruptcy is that cities, school districts, and other municipalities can use federal bankruptcy law to get around those constitutional protections and slash pensions and break union contracts. Right? So now places that have a lot of debt often have huge unfunded pension liabilities because when cities are going on a borrowing spree to make ends meet, they're also taking pension holidays, which is in effect borrowing from their workers, right? And so increasingly, what we're seeing is that the right is calling for municipal bankruptcy in places that have a lot of debt, in particular pension debt, because that's the way they can break the union. So in Chicago, so Illinois currently does not allow municipalities to file bankruptcy. Chapter 9 under the Federal Bankruptcy Code allows bankruptcy, but only if your state authorizes it. 26 states, including Illinois, don't. So bankruptcy is not an option. But Governor Rauner, who's himself a finance guy, who's a private equity firm manager, he has a big push now to sort of change that law because he wants to push Chicago public schools into bankruptcy so that he can slash the pensions and break the Chicago Teachers Union. And he's really using CPS's large debt load as a justification without ever sort of stopping to consider why CPS has to take out so much debt in the first place, which of course is because Illinois has the 5th most regressive tax system of any state in the country with a constitutional flat tax. That means that the billionaire governor has one of the lowest tax rates of any person in the state, right? And so finally, like my last point, which is that when unions are at the bargaining table, so this is a question, when we're at the bargaining table, what do we hear from city and state officials? Why can't they fund our bargaining proposals? What do they say?
Debt.
Debt, but also no money, right? They say there's no money. Is that true?
No.
Well, I'd say it actually is true. In many cases, there isn't money, right? But it's because the money is with the banks, the corporations, the billionaires that aren't paying their fair share in taxes. They've made a choice to pay them and give them the money. And it actually is true that our public budgets, governments actually are pretty much cash starved because they've made those choices already. And so in bargaining, the boss tells us, well, they can't give us a raise unless they slash community services, they pit workers against community members. And there's actually an element of truth to that, to what they're saying, because there really isn't that much extra money in there. So if we're just bargaining with the mayor or the governor, too often we're simply bargaining over the degree of austerity we're willing to accept. It's defensive bargaining to stop bad things from happening. A victory is if we don't have to take any concessions, or if the concessions are minor, right? That's how we define victory these days, which is problematic. But so what if we expand the scope of bargaining to say, well, instead of just fighting the mayor or the governor, we need to actually follow the money up the food chain. The mayor doesn't have the money to give us, it doesn't have enough money to both fund contracts and public services. But what if we actually take on the billionaires, the major corporations, the banks that do have that money, right? That can be a way we can go on offense in bargaining to tell the story of where the money has gone, to name the villains and put forth demands to make them pay to fully fund both workers and services. And by doing that, we can shift the narrative in our contract fights and make common cause with the broader community instead of being pitted against them. So just a very quick example, because I have 1 minute to go, so the city workers in Los Angeles, led by SEIU and AFSCME, were in contract bargaining. The contract expired in 2013, and they finally settled in 2014. Expired in 2014. They settled it last year. And so instead of doing traditional bargaining, they actually invited community organizations to join them at the bargaining table and put forth bargaining proposals about improving community services. And so they backed it up with a report that showed that as the city had slashed 5,000 jobs since the financial crash, city services of all stripes had actually significantly deteriorated, right? This is all 2008 to 2013, services all going down. And they found that at the same time, the city actually annually in publicly disclosed fees to banks paid $334 million a year. And that's just publicly disclosed fees. That's not principal or interest in any loans. It's just banking fees. And they found that basically this was double the street services budget for the entire city. Right? So very quickly, the campaign slogan became money for our streets, not Wall Street. And it completely changed the tone of the contract campaign. All the press coverage that they got was about how city workers were demanding that the city get back the money from the banks. And it wasn't just a talking point, it was actually true. And in the end, they won a terrific settlement where they got a commitment to restore the 5,000 jobs that have been lost since '08. They won a jobs commission so that would put policies in place to make sure that communities of color actually have access to those jobs, which historically was not the case. And they won a funded revenue commission that would look at ways to get money back from banks, renegotiate fees, and find new progressive revenue. And so by taking on Wall Street and going on offense together with community allies, we can actually win victories even in difficult bargaining environments in the face of budget deficits. Thank you.